that we've talked a lot about the process of studying, we've talked about like using different parts of the brain, but there are also different layers to information and understanding information, how to use it, which students may not be aware of, and we should probably make sure that they are.
So the like official learning science thing is called Bloom's taxonomy, or one of the things that talks about this. And basically, taxonomy is just how you organize information. And so if you imagine like a pyramid, kind of like if you've seen Maslow's hierarchy of needs, where it's like sleeping and eating is on the bottom, and then we get into the like things that once you have that, you can move up. Similarly, Bloom's taxonomy is really a like organizational pyramid of how we engage with knowledge and information. So at the bottom of the pyramid is going to be things like remembering, understanding words, which apparently is where we really need to start today.
That's okay.
So this is going to be things like memorization, recognition, right? That's a word I've seen before. Is this a bone, right? Yes or no, right? And so a lot of that base knowledge is just going to be that remembering, recognition. Understanding is going to ask you to do just a little bit more, and this might be where we get into things like the compare and contrast. What of these things go together, right? Like pick out the mammals versus the non-mammals, right? And so we're asking you to do a little bit more with that information than just like recognize that it's there. And so then we're going to move up into things like applying and analyzing, and that's going to ask you to do a little bit more than just, oh, yes, I understand what these things are and I can put them together. It's going to ask you to maybe put them together into different pieces or break them apart. How do they work together in processes?
Yeah.
How are they connected to one another? Applying, like, where do I see this in the world? Like, okay, you can tell me every single bone in the body, but if you can't tell me how I might actually use that in the real world.
Like which muscles are going to pull on it as you like drive your car.
Right. Like, how do I actually do this? If you're in a physics class, right? Like, okay, learning about torque and acceleration and whatever the other things they learn about in physics are, but like, okay, if I'm going to throw a baseball, what are those things do I need to know to effectively throw a baseball?
And I think a really good example that I use a lot is, like base level, you know what the heart is. Oh, it's a pump. And you go up to the next level. Okay, what does it relate to? Like, how does it work with blood and vessels? And then you go up to the apply level, like, okay, now how do I adjust that to control my blood pressure so I stay alive?
Yeah. And so that's we'll get to the like tippy top of the pyramid, but really the sort of lower levels and the middle levels, it feels like the questions that you're asking at the lower levels are like what, where, when, who, right? And the middle levels, you're asking questions that are more like why, how, what if, right? What happens if this thing stops working? What happens if we change the pH of this substance from a base to an acid, right? Like that's where you're getting into those apply and analyze questions. How does this work? Why is this happening? And what happens if I do something different or something changes? That is the key, that you're like doing more than just remembering and understanding. So the tippy top of the pyramid, the last couple things are evaluating and creating. So evaluating is where we're making judgments, right? And so you need to think about like an experiment, like how well does this experiment adhere to the scientific method, right? Would be an evaluation. How accurate or valid is this conclusion, right? You're being asked to make judgments based on a set of criteria. And creation is not just for artists, but it's like making something new or making it in a new way. So the difference between like evaluation and creation might be, evaluation is how well does this experiment adhere to the scientific method? Creation would be design an experiment that adheres to the scientific method and gets us this result.
Well, and even as you were talking, I was thinking like, where do you think teaching falls in all of this? Like creating a lesson or explaining it to like a study group, for example.
I think that's a really good point, is that if you are going to be like designing a way to explain something, right? That's creating an explanation. One, you need to know what the thing is. You need to know how to apply it and analyze it to figure out, okay, how do I best explain this? And then to actually create and put the sentences together is going to push you all the way through, which is one of the reasons why we say, if you can teach it to something or someone or a duck, that you actually probably really know the information because you've had to go through all of those.
And I would say that's exactly when I started to feel like I knew stuff. Like I went through, I got degrees, like I had the paper that said I knew the stuff.
You were
But once,
fully certified.
yeah. But once I started tutoring and then teaching, I was like, oh, now I know it. So that's why we always say that's kind of like the top end.
Yeah.
Now, why is it important for students to understand Bloom's taxonomy as
So
they come into college?
one of the things, you don't actually need to know all the specific levels, right? Like that is icing on the cake, right? You don't have to know all the jargon of, oh, is this understanding or is this analyzing? The basic idea is that we work with information in different ways. And the more you do with information, the more complex it is, the things that you do with information, the more likely you are to actually know and be able to recall that information, not just at a later time, but in like later situations, right? Like,
Which is kind of the point of college, right? So you learn the information, you can use it when you're in your career.
yes, like, and the point of college, often we get confused, is not so that you can use it on the exam. We want to be like, that's important too, because that's how you get the good grade and you graduate. But like, the real goal of learning and studying is so that you can recall that information in a variety of different situations, not just on the exam, right? Because on the exam, you can still be working out of that short-term memory. That's why cramming sort of works, but you don't.
But it was like, yeah.
Right.
And then you're going to have to do all that extra work on the next exam because exams build on each other or the next course. And then you're playing catch up. Like, it's just a snowball.
So, it is worth, putting in the effort, because it is going to take a little bit more time and effort to really learn something, as opposed to just like shove it into your brain long enough to be able to fall out on the exam. But if you're having to consistently do that over and over again, you might as well just put in the work and learn the thing, because then it will be a lot easier to recall at later in different situations.
Well, and I think also understanding how the hierarchy was like a pyramid, like, or think of it like stairs, right? Like, you got to build a good foundation or base. Like, you have to know what the words are before you really are going to know how to apply it. And so kind of working with your study sessions as you're setting your goals for your study sessions, like, do I have a good base? Do I know the what?
Who, what?
Thank you. And before I go into like the relationship type stuff. But also, I think, and this is why I really want to point this out, is this is information that students don't necessarily know when they come into college. And they feel like whatever they did before in their K through 12 is going to be what works in higher ed. And it's at a different level of Bloom's. So K through 12 system works more on that base.
Yeah.
And so
Or in that who, what,
yeah.
where.
And so a student might come in like, I was an A student in high school and this is what I did. And so I know how to study. And even as an instructor, we'll try to tell students, like, here's our suggestions. They don't feel like it necessarily applies for them because they have tons of scientific evidence to say, well, this is what works for me. Then they get their first exam and you're like, but I did the things that I know works.
Yeah.
And I didn't do well on an exam. And then it's just very defeating feeling. And what really happened was you did the base work, but then you're being tested at the mid-range or the upper level on Bloom's taxonomy. And so while you might go in and you might feel like, oh yeah, I recognized all the words, you might not have recognized that the question was asking you to apply or compare and contrast.
And that's also something that is really important, that like when you're literally reading a question on the exam, to be able to figure out, okay, what is this question actually asking me to do? Is it asking me to just recognize, define, understand at a base level, or is it asking me to do more with this information and take that next step? And so that's often where students, like you said, get tripped up, because in K through 12 in high school, we're often being asked to like
Closest association.
Right, like mostly be at those lower levels. And then at the university level, we're asking you to more so be at the mid or even the upper level on some of those upper level courses. The other thing I think that Bloom's taxonomy helps us is that, like, it's not an innate talent thing. This is a skill.
Yeah.
Right? Like, you can actually learn this stuff because it's about a process of helping you decode what you actually need to do to be successful. And it's not about like, oh, I'm just never going to learn this, or I suck at math, or whatever it is. It's actually a skill set that you're building about how to learn in addition to learning the information itself.
Yeah.